Good evening, everyone. It's one of my later evenings, and I had a good time reading your literary analyses of some of the chapters. One of the pieces of that which I would ask you to add when you're doing that, when you're thinking about literary analysis, is not only to point out some of the issues or the problems or the interesting features, but to try to figure out, well, how might they work? What does it do to have these kinds of things, these commonalities or these differences? What might we learn about this chapter from that? What might they be teaching us? For example, people who notice that all of the women in the book of Genesis, many of the women are barren. And eventually they're able to have children. What is that about? Why is that there? And so on. Well, one strategy has been, what this means is that childbirth and having children is not simply a natural act. And in each case, there is an aspect of divine intervention that in many cases, and even in the case, for example, of Leah, where she has a lot of children, that itself is a kind of divine intervention because she was not so well loved by her husband. So God, in a sense, gives her more children. But in each of these cases with Sarah and Rachel and Rebecca, there is a certain sense that the next leader is being chosen directly by God, and that's opening up her womb. It talks about God, Vayiftach et Rachma, that God opens her womb, and other kinds of things like that where we find interesting features. So then the question is, what do they mean? How do they work? What might they mean in the context of the story? Some of you did some very nice things with this already, and you've all been trying to work on this Auerbach understanding, and I wrote a little bit about that in the comments on Auerbach, that I think most of you really got that. What the features that are important to me from that are a little bit less of the heavy-duty theological ones, but much more the literary ones, which we call evocative literature. They evoke a response. We need to fill in the details. We don't know how people are feeling. We don't know what they're thinking. We don't know what they look like. We don't know all of that. And they evoke in us a response. What we will see when we get to Midrash, that Midrash is a direct response to this kind of literature. It's not accidental that biblical literature has a whole Midrashic literature responding to it, because that Midrashic literature, a lot of what it does is fill in the blanks, put in the details, respond to the kind of laconic is another word for this kind of material. So actually, I wound up speaking about the last two questions, and it's interesting also that I didn't really see anybody respond specifically to the question of Odysseus' scar, what the nature of the title that is for. I think it's, some of you, maybe it was already too obvious, but it would be interesting for some people at least to talk about that, perhaps in this summary statement that I'm doing now. As far as the first two discussion items were concerned, what I was really interested in was opening up the world of history and how history relates to this biblical material. You don't have to be interested in this necessarily, but we do like to see, if the material is supposed to have happened at a particular time, then the question is, did it really happen at that time, or is there any way for us to know one way or another? Of course, the question of what the it is, was there an Abraham, was there an Isaac, was there a Jacob? Who knows? What you've read about from McCarter is there all these attempts to link the literature to history. And that's what it's trying to do. And it finds different parts of the literature, but clearly the most important thing to start with is this was not written to be history. It was not intended to be history. This is not history writing. It's not historiographic in that sense, not intended to tell you what happened. So the question is, what is it intended to tell you? And we'll continue to talk about that. McCarter talks about ideology and not history. It's also just passing down stories. The stories are ideological, and the stories become representative of a people. and they become our national, the national story of the Jewish people. Every people has their national story, and we have ours. One of the interesting things we will see next session is that a great part of that national story, important part, takes place outside of the geographical confines of that nation, whether it happens in Egypt or whether it happens in the desert. Until we finally get to the land of Canaan, all kinds of important things happen in the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, the book of Leviticus too, and Deuteronomy. Most of the book of the 5 books of Moses don't take place in the land of Canaan. So what's that about, and why is that the case? And there have been lots of people who have tried to understand that. The question is, who were these Israelite people, where they came from, and can we even start talking about them until we get outside of the Chumash, outside of the Pentateuch, and move into the book of Joshua and Judges and so on. The material that comes before, the literature that comes before, seems to be something different. And I think all of you have been quite explicit, articulate, very well written about some of the issues that come up with regard to that literature. Its relationship to sacred things, to sacred texts. How does this literature, if it's not history, and it claims to be history, then how can it be sacred or holy or true or whatever? Well, if it doesn't claim to be history, then maybe that issue sort of begins to go away. The important thing is that it still does capture the imagination, and it still is the national story of the Jewish people. And in that sense, the text itself, the sacred text itself, is something which we continue to wrestle with, to engage, and it becomes part of our own identity, part of our own psyche, which is not to say that it's necessarily a better text, a more beautiful text, a finer text. In the Middle Ages, there were lots of people fighting over who's got the most beautiful text. Is it the Hebrew Bible? Particularly the Muslims would say, no, the Quran is the most beautiful text, and the calligraphy in the Quran, all the different aspects of the Quran were shown to be the most beautiful in the universe, not just the words, but the way it's written and so on. And the Jews in certain ways tried to do that. Actually, in the Middle Ages, the Jews tried to respond to the Muslims and their talking about how beautiful the Quran was by going back to the actual words of the biblical text and developing philology of Hebrew, etiologies, the origins of words, and the whole idea of Peshat, the simple meaning of the text, is something which is related to, in a certain sense, a kind of response to what was going on in the Christian world. That was not the only reason, but that was important for it. So we are now going to be moving forward out of the book of Genesis into a different aspect of the biblical materials as we move forward in the course. And I think that it's useful to understand that this entire book of Genesis, as we said, is made up of lots of different parts, lots of different pieces, and is in many ways the backstory of the Jewish people. It's the sort of, I wouldn't say mythical story, but it's the background story. And from that story, we can now begin to move forward in our studies next week, which will deal with the book of Exodus and some other materials, looking both at national issues of the Exodus from Egypt and that whole story, the beginnings of Jewish law, and the Ten Commandments, and perhaps some of the laws that are found with regard to the tabernacle, later on the temple, and so on. A lot of different things that we need to move forward with. Unfortunately, we are zipping through a lot of stuff, but I think that you are doing wonderful work throughout this class. I'm quite impressed with everything. I hope you'll be able to keep up with everything. Some of you, it looks like, are a little bit behind. And I would suggest that if you are that behind, don't just skip forward, but try to get through at least the discussion items in week in lesson 3 before going on to lesson 4. Particularly this writing your own literary analysis is a good exercise, and thinking about the literary analysis of The Binding of Isaac too, if you haven't gotten that far. So I hope tomorrow, that's Friday, to have lesson 4 up on the computer for you, and we can continue on that next week. Again, I'm available if you have questions, comments, want to speak with me privately, personally, whatever it is, just email me and we can arrange a time for that. So have a good week, and look forward to continuing reading your interesting things.